Hey everyone, I wanted to share a recent article that I came across on Philosophy Now, written by Matthew Hammerton, and it's titled The Good Life Paradox. And what's very interesting about this one is that he points out that there might very well be a difference between a meaningful life and a life of wellness. And he initially does this by imagining two people on their deathbeds. And very simply stated, imagine one person carries a life of enjoying the hedonistic pleasures, the simple pleasures of the world, where they didn't really have to achieve much or sacrifice much, but they lived steadily. They were on, let's say, a steady dopamine level their entire life. But then imagine the inverse, someone that champions social change, that risk themselves, their lives, and sacrifice so much for the people around them and even the world at large. The central theme that flows downstream throughout the rest of the article is this question of who lived the better life. Now, anyone that's willing to explore this critically will probably then ask, what do we mean by better in this context? And that's precisely what Matthew does. He highlights three different types of better, or rather good lives that one might live, to see where there might be either contradictions or similarities across these. And the first one is living a good moral life. Essentially, this would translate to how virtuous someone was. The second type is a prudential goodness, which highlights if someone's life actually just went well for them and their subjective experience. Was it easy? Was it smooth? Did they live with positivity? Did they get their way? These are all markers to determine someone's subjective experience in the world and how well it went for them. And then there's this third kind, and this third kind refers to, was it meaningful for them? And it seems to be that these could be very distinct, but they could also be all very similar. And this is precisely what this article was trying to get at. Now, Matthew then asks the question of, is the meaning in life that we're talking about just the same thing as well-being? And it seems like there might be a contradiction here. That's what I thought initially, because I thought we were trying to make distinctions between these types of good lives. Again, to recap, just the moral, the prudential, and the meaningful. But he's then now asking, maybe wellness and meaning are just the same thing. So if we refer to the subjective experience one is having of it being well, that would be the same as the meaningful life that they would also be living. But he also challenges this further too. He notes three failed defenses that are recognized in philosophy as a way to isolate meaning as its own enterprise, and he highlights then where he thinks that they fall short. For the first one, some have claimed that there are just simply different types of goodness that one can experience, with wellness being more of a subjective experience relating to their own pleasures and satisfactions, whereas meaning is actually more of an objective domain. It's something that has to do with the external achievement. It has something to do with other people involved in the situation, and that's why meaning and wellness must then be separate. This article writes that this is actually not very tenable as a description or a definition of wellness, because Matthew introduces a thought experiment here, imagining being plugged into some matrix-like machine that is constantly feeding him all of his desires and satisfactions while just being plugged into a computer for the rest of time, and actually equates this to saying that, well, your desires are fulfilled and satisfied, and you're experiencing the subjective phenomenological experience of wellness, you're still being denied the objective reality that very well exists and has implications on yourself and the other people's lives around you. Therefore, it cannot also be wellness. So he extracts this component of subjective experience in wellness and actually says that no, because even if you were in that situation, that would also very likely be claimed as not a wellness type of life, that you're not living a fulfilling life, even if just all of your immediate desires were randomly fulfilled. And where my mind goes, at least from here, is I try to extract this and imagine the conversations that are very prevalent in pop culture now, which is this concept of what if we're living in a simulation now? And I try to see where the differences are between this. And what I'm finding is that it seems that the implications have to do with other people. So it's almost like we don't know if we live in a simulation now or if we ever will, or what that even would be like, or what would be different about reality if we were living in a simulation, because we only know what we've experienced. However, if we do agree that other conscious lives do exist in our lives, whether or not we're living in a simulation would actually bear some weight on us still being in this simulated reality. It would actually be more meaningful and more wellness than us being plugged up to a computer, even in this world, because we understand that our actions and our responsibilities also bear the implication and the weight of other people around us. Whereas in his situation, just being plugged into a scenario of a mental map or a matrix-like simulator that is completely isolated from an objective world would only benefit the subject themselves. So that seems to be the differentiating factor, that wellness, meaning are inextricably tied to the implications that your choices and your actions and responsibilities have on the other people around you as well. Now, the second failed defense is this idea that pleasure has nothing to do with meaning. And Matthew pinpoints this by imagining two lazy situations where, let's say, two people are just simply living hedonistic lives and they're lazy, they are sitting on the couch, playing games, eating junk food, just experiencing hedonism. And if you were to gauge who had the life of more wellness, it would simply then just be based on who had more pleasure, if you could use that as a metric. Now, of course, his opposition towards this and his challenge toward this is that it actually doesn't give any bearing on the concept of wellness, but rather pleasure. So he fractures this idea of wellness as just an enterprise of subjective pleasure, particularly short-sighted subjective pleasure, and says that a meaningful life is not just isolated, it would still be tied to a life of wellness, because he's arguing that meaning and wellness have a symbiotic relationship with each other, especially when viewed through the lens of valuable achievements, which tend to carry both. But I really want to put an asterisk on this concept of value, and we'll carry that after the third defense, because I really do believe that it underpins and carries a tether between how we make value-driven decisions and how we gauge what it really means to live a life of meaning and wellness, and how we can experience those things in ourselves based on the things that we find most significant, most preferable, and that we're directed to. Now, this third failed defense can get very tricky because it deals with the relationship that one has to their experience of pleasure and suffering, rather than pleasure, suffering, wellness, and meaning as just a standardized measurement of their life. And some argue that the more meaning that you experience does not mean that you also experience more wellness. The example that's provided here is imagining Van Gogh, who pursued the depths and the meaning involved in his pursuit of painting while also suffering immensely in the process. And Matthew actually flips that on its head a little bit by saying, well, he actually experienced more wellness by pursuing the things that he sought were meaningful. And when you imagine that, you can maybe imagine Van Gogh suffering even more without the ability to express and to convey his thoughts and his ideas through the medium of his painting. And this is why it gets into a very, very tricky debate, if you may, because we are using these very vague terms like wellness and meaning as a distinct measurement for someone's subjective experience. And again, I think what's more important is actually their relationship to the experience. Because the example that I often give is imagining someone at the gym who's constantly adding more weight and getting that progressive overload, and imagine squatting 500 pounds, let's say, and there's so much difficulty, struggle, and suffering in that, but because it's in pursuit of something that's meaningful to someone, they actually experience the wellness of that, even though the physical sensations might be straining and might be of a detriment to that person if you're going to measure wellness just as pleasure. But when you look at it in its entirety, as from a holistic point of view, there is wellness in the pursuit. It's achieving hard things. It's getting yourself disciplined. It's doing the things that allow you to live a wholly healthy life outside of just your intake. It's also the activity. So there's so many benefits that exceed the simple sensation or the pleasure, which also contributes to this notion that meaning and wellness might actually be more intertwined than we think, at least as opposed to these defenses. Now, Matthew Hammerton, the associate professor of philosophy at Singapore Management University, goes a little bit more in depth and explores this a little bit more, but I'll just put the link below for you to check out so that you can come up with your ideas and thoughts and challenges on the matter. But he does propose a slight solution to this, and he has put together the framework and put together this mental map. I at least imagine it as like a Venn diagram between wellness and meaning, and to see their distinctions and where they overlap. And that's what I have gathered from this. But he further claims that there's no single answer to choosing a life of wellness or choosing a life of meaning, and which one is quote unquote better, that there's no distinct universal answer to that. But he does propose this idea that sometimes and in different contexts in one's life, some people will vouch for more balance and less impact, and more impact and less balance, because those are what seem to be are sometimes contradictory. Whereas if you want the holistic perspective of financial and relational and health, whatever the case might be, you might be sacrificing the impacts you can make in one very precise and distinct area, but you are achieving that balanced life as a whole. With the flip side being the one who completely immerses themselves into one task and skill set where they can make a greater impact in their area of expertise, let's say even if it was music or science or sports or whatever the case might be, but then also foregoing that balanced, holistic approach. And the answer essentially comes down to what you find more valuable. And Matthew proposes this as a way to say there's wisdom in recognizing that there is a choice between these in different contexts. I really want to hone in on this idea that I talked about previously, and it's about this idea of value. We typically see it as self-evident and that our values tend to guide our decision makings. And while that's true, what then guides our values? And I think that this is an appropriate question to ask because it could be the fundamental decision that sits behind if we choose a balanced context or an impactful context. Now, I would say that the logical approach here is to understand what your circumstances are. I think depending on your circumstances, that will heavily determine which one you're going to lean towards in a specific context. For example, if you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you have a lot of your physiological and psychological needs met, maybe then you'll take the risk to make a life of more impact in a certain domain because you have the other fundamentals that are necessary for you to live a life of wellness already at least well established to some capacity. And that would definitely gauge the decision as with respect to that time in your life, of course. And I think that that's very pertinent to recognize. And I think that's the point that this article is trying to make, is that it's not just up to you, but it's also up to you to be aware of your situations as to when you should take those risks and when you should seek out more balance. But I really want to take that even further again, because when I view this concept of value, I really would like to have a definitional understanding of value. And I think that answer lays somewhere in the lines of what is significant to us and what is more preferable. And then the logical question, of course, again, is, well, then what makes something more preferable to you? And this is where it's very interesting, because I do believe that how you see yourself is actually one of the ingredients to acknowledging or understanding what informs your values. So if you're someone that doesn't believe that you can achieve something or has that imposter syndrome, you can very easily convince yourself that you much more value the balanced life. You could have that cognitive dissonance where, you don't want to experience or recognize or witness a potential life of impact in one specific sphere because you can't even conceptualize that that is a possibility. Therefore, you might not actually value it. So I'm very curious and skeptical of the things that we choose as our values, and if they're natural values that are, let's just say, true and highest self would adhere to, or if they are just copes that allow us to live a life of comfort. And not saying that balance is at all comfortable, because of course that can come with the sacrifice of the goals and the things that you're deeply passionate about. This works vice versa. I just want to make it clear that there are again different contexts by which this could work. But I think that how you view yourself and the psychological relationship you have with both yourself and your surroundings will greatly inform your values. And it's really about being as honest and employing the humility necessary to understand what it is that you value. If you could have everything that you wanted in your life without any barriers, without feeling scared, without that risk of failure. And also, I do want to note that in the pursuit of success comes the risk of failure. It's actually almost imperative to fail in the pursuit of success. That is literally how we learn and how we're able to iterate our experiences to become more successful and better at what we're doing. But that would obviously be a side point, which so many people already talk about and is not too relevant to this here. I really want to dig in again to the conceptual side of these terms that we're using, such as meaning and such as value. And again, when I go back to this concept of significance, it really begs the question, if what we value is what we find significant, I'm curious about what it is that we seek significance within ourselves in that we're actually tending to when we make our decisions. It's almost like significance and values have a reciprocal relationship. It's like a feedback loop where we want to choose our values based on what we find significant, and what we find significant is based on our values, but not just in the external world, also in the internal world, which is what I find so fascinating from a psychological perspective, because we want to be significant with respect to the rest of the world. We want to be different. That's the ego that typically talks and that creeps its way through. And when we, in the pursuit of significance, we want to be successful. We usually compare significance with success or growth or progress. These are proxies for happiness and wellness in many ways. So when we choose the outlets, let's just say balance, when we really would rather choose the impact because we want to be significant, it's actually almost like a test of oneself that one has regarding what it means for them to be significant, because they think that they will achieve more progress in the domain of balance, therefore experiencing more significance, more meaning as a whole. But they might have just convinced themselves out of something that they actually found more significant, which was a life of impact in a specific sphere. Again, this works both ways. So I want to leave just you with that question there of what do we mean by values? What do we mean by significance? And if we're achieving or seeking significance through our values, what is it within ourselves that we want to be significant or recognized as? And I'm going to take an abstract leap here. I'm also curious if meaning is a truthful tenet of consciousness. Because if we recognize that conscious beings will tend to something that is meaningful, and that's what gives their life that significance and the drive to engage their will so that they can enact the things that are both impactful to themselves and the world and the people around them, then it might not be such a far off claim to say that meaning is actually inherent to conscious agents, that it's not just a construct of the mind, but instead it is intertwined with the fact that you have to make value-driven decisions when you're aware conscious agent. Therefore, meaning is almost inescapable. And I'm curious, as a thought experiment, what you would think of that, because of course there are many debates and there's a dichotomy between, oh, is meaning inherent to life and is meaning just a human construct? And I mean, there's so many different ways to go about that, because it depends on what we mean by meaning, again, which is something very critical, that's very critical to ask. But rather, I'm curious about this idea that if we recognize that there are conscious agents in the world who will make value-driven decisions, because they have to sacrifice some decisions for some that are more valuable, more significant, more impactful, more preferable, you can fill in these different terms, then meaning will always be a foundational component to that pursuit, because you experience the meaning of that, and that meaning will then drive you further towards the things that you seek are more valuable and can impact more people around you and benefit both yourself and the world. So there's so many different ways to go about this. I like these free-form thoughts, and I'd love to know what you think about that as well. Please feel free to check out the article. I thought it was super cool, and we'll talk to you on the next one for sure. So remember to be human. Thank you so much.